Good morning, and welcome to day 3 of Affordable Medicines Now. Awesome. We'll be talking later this afternoon about how everything's gone and what comes next and how we continue to build. But I'm just super excited to see you all here for a third bright and shiny morning. Absolutely. So this morning we have a really exciting panel, which I'm not going to give a huge opening to because I want to dive right into it. But I'm excited to have our panel moderated by Annette Gaudino, who is the co-director. Exactly. The co-director of the Hepatitis C program at Treatment Action Group. And we are super excited to talk about some of the larger scale impacts on global access and local access as well. So I will hand it over to Annette.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I hope you're all inspired and energized by yesterday's amazing women's action at the Hart Building and at the DOJ. Yes, I know some of you on the panel and also here in the room participated, and I'm incredibly envious that I was not able to join you. So thank you for giving us a much-needed lift. So I want to introduce my panelists, and then I'm going to make some opening remarks and then let them do their presentations. So with us today, we have Leo Palumbo from Medicine Sans Frontiers, the Access Campaign, also known as Doctors Without Borders. We have Suraj Madoori, my colleague at Treatment Action Group, based in New York City. It works globally, locally and nationally. We have Dana Gill from the Initiative for Medicines, Access, and Knowledge here to talk with us. I'm so happy to have her. And we have Rachel Cohen, who was arrested yesterday, I believe, and she's with Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. And we're really happy to have them here to give a range of perspectives. So, why are we having an international a panel discussing international access to medicines at a conference that's mostly domestic activists or activists working in the domestic space? Well, as we've seen throughout the conference, tackling pricing for medicines has short, medium, and long-term structural solutions. A lot of the stories and the history that we're inspired by shows how that's played out in the international space. In the context of battles against HIV/AIDS, you can trace an arc from drugs into bodies in the US and other high-income countries to starting to tackle and address systemic oppression, obviously homophobia, but also sexism, racism, poverty, and the criminalization of drug use and other things like sex work that impacted and helped, unfortunately, spread and drive the pandemic. The demands of the Global South to access, we also see this in the demands of the Global South to access the privatized fruits of technological progress. Coming together, all this kind of came together with the approval of protease inhibitors in the mid-90s. It's not a cure, but it was a chance for survival. We heard on day one how activists based in the US and in South Africa decided to take up this demand for life-saving, for the lifeline of ARVs to the tens of millions of people who were living with AIDS across low and middle-income countries. Starting with simple bird-dogging actions targeting then presidential candidate Al Gore, a global movement based in South Africa was launched that eventually won funding for the infrastructure to sustainably, that is profitably, produce generic antiretrovirals for over 14 million people. I'll note that's only half of the people in the world who need them. So 20 plus years on, there's still much work to be done. You can basically say that South Africa saved the world, but they did it with the help of India. We heard yesterday about activists, including the co-founder of I-Mak, who's represented here on this panel, who worked to ensure that the legal system in India judged that the first antiretroviral was a true invention, something that had never been seen before, a novel medicine, but that every other retroviral that came down the pipeline and direct-acting antivirals that we've seen with hepatitis C are just a variation on a theme. They don't merit a patent. They're just repeating work that was already done. Patent reviewers, in other words, bureaucrats, have decided the fates of millions. You're going to learn more about how that works and an alternative models for developing and delivering essential medicines, both from I-Mak and DNDi on this panel. So this work was based on the lived experience of people facing a deadly stigmatized disease. If you're not already familiar, I really urge you to go look up the Denver Principles and to read them. The Denver Principles were drafted by people living with HIV, and I'll just share the preamble. I think it has lessons for all healthcare justice activists. We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term that implies defeat, and we're only occasionally patients, a term that implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS. That later became people living with AIDS or people living with HIV. These principles are echoed in the phrase, "nothing about us without us," which is most famously used by the sex worker rights movement, but certainly applicable to anyone facing illness or disability, potentially everyone. So we wanted to have this panel because we really need to raise and explore the impact of US trade and foreign policy in this story as a tool for private corporate power to enforce their interests here and abroad. Throughout this conference, folks have raised how the US medicine development model captures public money to return private profit. We actively enforce this model in the US through our patent laws against the interests and demands of people. And then we export it through bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. And then that story gets obscured. So for example, Trump didn't kill the TPP. It had already been killed by healthcare justice activists and labor and the global labor movement, opposed to the intellectual property provisions in the deal, which directly threatened the lives of millions of people living with HIV. In other words, the US government's zest to protect Disney from pirated movies would have destroyed the generic medicine supply chain based in India. Millions of people would have died. The foreign freeloader myth, it's yet another grotesque projection from this administration. It's multinational corporations based in high-income countries that are parasites feeding off public research dollars in people's lives. They are the freeloaders, okay? Let's make that clear. Medicine Sans Frontiers provides, I think, a really useful and illustrative example of the power of saying no to them. And Treatment Action Group will also discuss how the problem is not what other high-income countries are doing right. In addition to learning what other more civilized high-income countries are doing, learning from the work of the Global South is part of decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing our analysis of the problem and decentering our proposed solution, which, let's face it, have failed this country. American exceptionalism in healthcare is lethal. We should not be exporting it. Thinking ahead to our discussion after the presentations, I want to highlight what Sean McElwee, a writer and former policy analyst at Demos and creator of the Abolish ICE hashtag, called the power of simple maximalist demand with a clear moral vision. This is what we should be guided by, and hopefully some of the content that you'll see in these presentations will help you develop and think about that. And with that, I'll leave it to my first panelist, Leo. Take it away.
Okay. Well, I'm Leonardo Palumbo, and I'm the U.S. Policy Advisor for Doctors Without Borders and the Access Campaign. I wanted to talk to you today a bit. I'll explain a bit about MSF and then why we're talking about this topic. We're an international humanitarian medical organization with projects in 70 countries. It spans both conflict zones as well as natural disasters, epidemics, and disease outbreaks. And then why we work on access to medicines. In the process of doing our work, we saw that often the products we need do not exist, aren't adapted to the countries we work in, and if they do exist and are adapted for the countries we work in, oftentimes are not affordable. And that's also across the full spectrum of diagnostics, medicines, and vaccines. And then we actually started the Access campaign about 20 years ago when Doctors Without Borders won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I would say we fit into also a broader access to medicines movement that has been fighting for 20 years for access to medicines and for, as Annette was saying, for countries to be able to use rights to either have new tools to enforce generic competition, ensure that they are able to make use of strict patentability laws. And so we're part of that movement. But just as Annette was saying, it's come up a couple of times, what impact competition has. So the price of ARVs started in 2000 at 10,000 per person per year, and with generic competition, we've been able to drop it to less than $100 per person per year, what we have today. And it's also, let's say, this is just until 2011. It's also, you could go further, but in this period of, let's say, 20 years, we've also had countries like Brazil, Thailand, and other countries make use of compulsory licensing to promote generic competition, as well as, yes? Okay, and acting retroviral,
Yes.
acting retrovirals,
HIV drugs.
HIV drugs. Thank you. It's a good question. And so, what can we learn from about, let's say, HIV? So there are tools like price negotiations, pooled procurements, but generic competition is a game changer. And this has come up a couple times, but just to reiterate it, oftentimes medicines are not necessarily expensive to produce. It's at their high price. So it's not necessarily high cost, it's high price. And then as I was saying earlier, okay, so not ARVs, HIV medicines fell by 99%, the price. And then I think it was specifically 21 million people were able to access ARVs through India's patent law, and being able to produce generic HIV medicines for other countries. And then this is also these same tools, so it's not just limited to HIV. Other countries have used it for hepatitis C medicines, for cancer medicines. And then I'm not sure how many of you were following. I know it was mailed onto the one of the mailing lists last week. But even the New York Times had called for the U.S. to make use of similar provisions in law. And actually, all of the members of Congress on the House side who spoke at this conference have also signed a letter to HHS calling for the U.S. to make use of these provisions in U.S. law for hepatitis C medicines. So how does the high-priced medicine debate in the U.S. fit into the global debates? I would say that it started getting a lot more attention with the onset of sofosbuvir. I don't see Clifton, but yesterday he was explaining it's $1,000 per pill, and that kind of just sparked public outrage and mobilized the American public, but really patient groups, payers, even AARP, a lot of groups, medical practitioners, even policymakers. And then Justin brought this up yesterday, and all of our panelists are going to talk about it. But I just wanted to also explain how Trump's drug pricing blueprint fits into this. Annette mentioned that there is this idea that other countries are, because we're paying more money for medicines because other countries are paying less, and it's really based on a false premise because first off, there's no established link between companies' investment in R&D and the amount of money that they charge, and secondly, companies in the U.S. are allowed to charge whatever price they want based on what they believe the market would bear. And just to briefly to develop this further, Annette was talking about how U.S. put pressure on other countries for making use of public health safeguards, and it's something that's not necessarily something of the past. It's still ongoing. Even this year, the U.S. Trade Representative is looking into countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Malaysia, amongst others, for making use of public health safeguards to promote generic competition. And for me, it goes back to something that's Rokana brought up. He asked us, what type of America do we want? And I would just put that question to you. Do you really want to live in an America where we're let's say, taxpayer resources are being used to actually go after other countries for what their policies to promote access to medicines. And then there's two other aspects that I just want to briefly highlight because they've been touched on in other panels, but there is mention to transparency and mostly how it relates to PBMs, but then it kind of misses the wider picture of transparency, how much companies invest in R&D, how much public funding is used, intellectual property barriers, clinical efficacy, and manufacturing costs. And there are some proposals both at state and federal level, and yet these innovative proposals aren't reflected in the blueprints. And then the last thing, which is what is missing, is it doesn't talk about any other ways to incentivize innovation. It's a kind of, I'm going to talk about our specific proposal for tuberculosis, but just as an example of how you could innovate. But then there are ideas for prize funds and other ways to get the innovation that we need without just relying on monopolies. And then, as Annette was saying, we're going to talk about the power of saying no, but I just wanted to highlight one thing that our international president at the time said, that when in his speech when Doctors Without Borders won the Nobel Peace Prize, he talked about that people are dying from curable diseases, and then there's also sometimes medicines aren't available because it's not financially viable, and then he highlighted that MSF and Doctors Without Borders, what we want is not charity, it's change. And I think it's just important to think about for us what type of long-term solutions do we want? Do we want, let's say, a small fix, or do we actually want the whole system changed? So I'm going to talk a bit about our Fair Shot campaign. Vaccinations is a key part of MSF's work. Last year, we vaccinated 2.9 million children. And then this is a long story, and I'll try to make it simple. But after, in 2011, we saw that the price of pneumonia vaccines started to be a barrier to actually both our work and national ministries of health in terms of scaling up vaccination programs. So we, after 4 years of negotiations, we actually made an exception to a longstanding MSF policy against taking donations, because we thought the need for these vaccines were so high. But even when we accepted a time-limited donation, both companies, Pfizer and GSK, they had put a lot of restrictions in terms of which countries we could use, wanted really detailed monitoring your reports backs. And this is something that came up yesterday, and I'm not, this I should also find out more, but then it's also a tax break for companies when they give donations. And then, but we also had accepted this fully knowing that soon we'd be launching a public campaign. And then just to explain, the objectives were to get to lower the price for vaccines for all developing countries and humanitarian NGOs to $5, and to increase price transparency. And then why people should care? Well, 1 million children die from pneumonia every year, and then Pfizer, and this is probably even outdated. At the time, GSK and Pfizer had already made a total of 40 billion in sales from the pneumonia vaccines. And then these are a bit of the outcomes of the campaign, so I might jump back to that. But so since we saw that negotiating with the company didn't work, when we launched the campaign, actually for World Pneumonia Day, we brought 17 million fake dollars to Pfizer's headquarters in New York, because every day, that's how much money they make off of the pneumonia vaccine. And volunteers also brought 2,500 carnations one carnation for every child that dies every day from not being vaccinated from pneumonia. And then actually, jump back to the other slide. We had over 400,000 people sign a petition, and actually, if you have, I'll tweet a link to it, but you can watch a video of actually our colleague. And I just wanted to say what the outcome was. So Pfizer and GSK did agree to creating a humanitarian mechanism. So we did get a reduced price for humanitarian NGOs. What did not happen was getting the price for all developing countries. So we're still continuing our work on vaccinations. Our colleague Dana is going to talk about patent challenges later on, but MSF is currently challenging the patents for Pfizer's pneumonia vaccine in Korea and in India in an effort to bring a lower cost competition to markets. And the next thing I wanted to talk about is how innovation fits in. We also heard from a lot of even congressmen who were coming here, taxpayer dollars are going into funding innovation. And then I just wanted to highlight for us, for Doctors Without Borders, high prices are the symptom of a broken innovation system. And just to highlight that it's currently not sustainable and not delivering patient-needed innovations. And then what we need to push for is ways to achieve both innovation and access. And one idea that has been talked about a lot is the idea of separating the cost of healthcare innovation from the price of products. And I know I said one tool is prize funds, and I know actually said like this, it probably seems very abstract, but I'm going to try to give one example of let's say how this issue is also very relevant to even to issues happening today. How many people are medical professionals in the room? Okay, only a handful.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you probably know that every year in the U.S. that there's 23,000 people who die from antibiotic resistance, and then it's been 30 years since we haven't had a new class of antibiotics. Right now, Congress is debating the Pandemic All Preparedness Hazards Act, and what they want to look at is how we can generate countermeasures to pandemics that we need. And part of this, they're recognizing that antimicrobial resistance is a growing challenge, and but certain members in the House are they view that yes, we do need to incentivize innovation, and the best way that, in their opinion, the best way to do that is by allowing companies who do develop new antibiotics an extension on monopoly. So that's something that we're a couple of the organizations in the room are trying to work on, talking with these offices and also explaining that there's other ways to incentivize. We don't need to extend monopolies or lower regulatory standards. And even there's been scientific studies from on the impacts of extending monopolies for antibiotics elsewhere in the U.S. And it found that 2 minutes, okay. It found that antibiotics that were incentivized with monopolies, aren't necessarily clinically superior. It's just more expensive. So then, just to try to give a practical example, and then I'm going to move quickly just through TB, as I was saying. Last year, Doctors Without Borders, we treated close to 20,000 tuberculosis patients, as well as close to 3,000 patients with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And when you have multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, it means that you're on a treatment regimen for 2 years, take 14,000 pills. Most of the medicines that you take were developed over 40 years ago. And then, so what we're trying to do is also promote a system where you can, through grants, push and pull researchers to work together. And then pool the intellectual property and data to be able to, for other manufacturers, researchers, to be able to develop compounds further. And why, particularly for tuberculosis, is there's really a limited amount of research and development funds. It's desperately needed. There's only been, in the past 50 years, 2 new medicines that have come to market. And still, of those 2 new medicines, only about 12% of patients globally have access to them. So I'm just gonna, I know I have 1 minute, but I'm just gonna be really brief with this. But also for tuberculosis, there's several other drug pricing reduction strategies. Since I brought up drug-resistant tuberculosis, globally there's about close to 600,000 people who have drug-resistant tuberculosis out of the 10 million people living with tuberculosis in the world. So that is a very small market. But countries also try to pool demand through global drug facility. Also for some of the new medicines that I mentioned that came to market, if they're not registered in countries, what Doctors Without Borders does is we, through humanitarian waivers or rapid registration programs, try to get them into countries. So the point I really want to make is that there's a number of strategies that can be used to be able to promote access. And I'll end on that.
Thank you, Leo. And I just want to add one point to Leo's presentation. I think he was a little bit too humble about what MSF did with regard to pneumonia vaccines, because when they rejected the donation, the proposed donation from pharma, they got hell from all quarters. People were like, how can you turn down free stuff? Because they have a larger goal, change, not charity. So I just wanted to really highlight that. And with that, Suraj.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Before I even start, I just really want to recognize my colleague, Tim Horn, who was critical and helped me, just do these slides. And, he was actually originally supposed to be here, but couldn't make it. And also, I'm going to try to do my best impression of him while I'm up here. So bear with me. And because I'm sure he's watching. Hi, Tim. So anyways, this presentation, I'm really glad I got a chance to do this because, I think a lot of you have been hearing about this supposed blueprint, right? And, one of the biggest things that we need to break down in terms of a myth is that this whole freeloader type of sort of illustration that the Trump administration is currently sort of projecting, right, as a way to basically reduce prices here. And, and the ultimate question is that, this will ultimately not lower prices here. And we just need to sort of set that up front. But I do think it is worth looking at other countries because, while we certainly can't, go after them for drug prices here, there are a lot of things that they're doing right. So I do think that we should be looking at other countries and seeing what they're doing around really containing the cost of drugs. And actually, when I read something like this, and this sort of connects back to what Leo was saying earlier, this actually is not so much the administration is doing this for you to lower drug prices. I really read this as a mandate to the U.S. trade representative, right, as to what he needs to do, or what they need to do, I should say, in really trying to just sort of expand corporate power for pharma, overseas, and also obviously in the interest of these very large multinational corporations. So that's just sort of another way to read this when I read something like this, that it really is a mandate for the USTR to basically go after countries for doing what they're doing and what they do in sort of expanding access to critical medicines for their citizens, which any government should do. And so I want to start with this, with a graph of pharmaceutical profits, right? And this was released by the Government Accountability Office within our own U.S. government. The sort of thing I want you guys to notice within this graph is that when you look at the profit margins of pharmaceutical corporations in the U.S., the profit margins are outrageous, like at 20%. Right, and that's about $775 billion, just in I think it was like 2017 alone. And so when you look at the lower line at the bottom, the normal average rate of profit, right, is around 4 to 9% for any industry that's non-pharmaceutical, right? So in the U.S., the bottom line is that, you know, it's a very profitable industry, you know. And what's interesting is, like, when you look at a country like Canada and you compare, you know, our closest neighbor and seeing what they're doing, one of the most critical things to sort of point out is the fact that they, you know, they have domestic sales at about like 14.5 billion just in the past year. Um, and at the same time, we're also be able to invest a large amount of that money, about 700 million, into R&D. And so when we talk about sort of the need to have really high drug prices to fund R&D, the drug prices in Canada are much lower, right? So the companies are still making a significant profit, and that profit is out of, like, that. The 700 million is out of 14.5 billion dollars worth of profit. So that margin is still huge, and R&D is still getting funded. So even if we just look up north, that myth can totally be broken. And so Leah was also talking about delinkage of R&D and pricing. And so this was another report that was set out by the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. And what they were analyzing was that, you know, these myths around whether or not, you know, if we really work on expanding access and lowering price, right, that will ultimately reduce R&D for other sort of critical cures and other treatments that we need. That is another myth that we really need to sort of break down in the global space, because, you know, drug manufacturers do set prices to drive profits. That is very true. But at the same time, you know, we need to realize that even when drug manufacturers are doing R&D, they're not necessarily doing R&D in the way that we like, right? I mean, there are a lot of they will develop drugs that may not have the exact therapeutic effect that we need. They make drugs that are easily patentable, right? They use evergreening practices. They use all these ways in which they can sort of control the sort of profit kind of timeline of developing that drug, and also what is going to give them the most market. So it's not going to be the neglected diseases or things like that. So we also that take into bunk, you know, we really need to sort of focus on delinking R&D and pricing as another sort of critical message. And I find it so interesting that, you know, a lot of these sort of statements and conclusions are coming from the government itself. So we're actually seeing that the government itself is recognizing that, you know, it is being sort of very contradictory when it's issuing reports, whether it's the Government Accountability Office or even the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. You know, it's basically saying things that we already know, but not sort of following up with in terms of policy. So here are some of the big questions. Will bilateral and multilateral pressure on other high-income countries to release controls on drug pricing actually result in lower list prices in the United States? I think everyone knows that the answer to that question. These are very rhetorical, obviously, right? Even if we reduced U.S. profits translates into reduced R&D, would the number of clinical important high-impact drugs and biologics actually decline? No. And I think, like Matt said this yesterday, there's very little empirical evidence that any of this would actually, you know, that we would somehow stop the innovation that we need, that we would somehow lower drug prices, right? And that would somehow suddenly, you know, completely collapse our R&D structure or allow us to sort of develop the cures and treatments that we need. It's just simply not true. And so what do we need to really sort of look more globally. I agree. Like, we need to look at other countries for sure to see what they're doing correct. And when you level the playing field a bit and just like look at some other countries beyond Canada, such as Australia, Germany, and the UK, and just sort of line them up, right? You really got to start asking some critical questions, right? And these are just some basic numbers, as you can tell. And the ones I'm obviously going to point to are pharmaceutical spending per capita and healthcare spending per capita, right? And then life expectancy. So these countries are doing something correctly, right? And in many ways have very similar economic. They're high-income countries. They have just the same amount of health and access to medicine needs that U.S. citizens do, but they're doing things vastly different. And we need to really figure out what is it about their health systems that allow them to basically expand access to critical medicines while also saving money, right? And what you'll see is like sort of a common theme that within health systems planning for a lot of these countries, drug pricing controls is sort of front and center. It's sort of intentionally wrapped within the healthcare system versus sort of being separated as like a different issue that needs to be addressed altogether, like we do in this country. So, I know that there's also a lot of conversation here and happening across the United States around single payer, universal healthcare. And I urge folks that who are part of those movements and who are involved in state level legislation to really look at legislation to see how are they actually having very specific ways in which drug prices are being controlled. I do think that's a very unique feature in a lot of the other countries that we're going to take a look at right now. And so Australia, for example, they have like a Medicare for all type of scheme. But what's interesting is that they have a national purchasing of pharmaceuticals through something called the PBS. And so what happens with Australia is that it essentially is the sole buyer, right? So there's basically one customer within all of Australia. That's the government of Australia. And so what happens is that basically shifts the power differential in the favor of the government, because now it is the only way to negotiate is that you only have we have one buyer with all the money, so they're going to be able to sort of dictate the terms around pricing and access and things like that. But what's really great also about Australia is they have something called the PBAC, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. And what they basically do is that they assess the safety and efficacy of medications, right? And they also, utilizing health economics, study the cost effectiveness of drugs. And then depending on whether those drugs are cost effective or, as well as sort of safe and efficacious, will they actually purchase the drugs from the manufacturer, right? So it sort of almost behooves the manufacturer to make sure that they are putting quality assured medicines forward. And if there are generics available that are as equivalent as brand name drugs, they will opt for generics. So they will just go after generics as a way to also save money, but also make sure that those generics are just as viable and just as efficacious as brand name drugs. And if just say that you are a consumer that wants access to brand name drugs, they do facilitate access to brand name drugs, but also but mostly put that cost on the consumer in the form of something they called like a brand name premium, right? But are still capping that cost at a certain rate. So it's a really magnificent scheme because I think the biggest thing is that it allows them to basically pool all their purchasing power in one way so that they can effectively negotiate with pharma and to ensure that they also are, providing low-cost access to the drugs to all their citizens. And if you look at a country like Germany, which has a universal multi-payer system with statutory insurers, and optional private, I'd say that this is a little bit like the U.S. in many ways. But what's interesting about Germany is that they people also have out-of-pocket costs, but they cap out-of-pocket costs. So the maximum someone will pay for any drug is about $30, and the lowest that they'll pay, I think, is around like $4 in terms of copays. But very much like Australia, what's also interesting is that drugs with no added value are placed into groups where so do folks know what a reference price is? Yeah. So reference price real quickly is that, let's just say that you have like several drugs, right? Take Tylenol, for example, like acetaminophen. Like you might have like 7 versions of it, right? So why, and they're all sort of efficacious, but they might have different prices. So what essentially reference pricing allows you to do is you kind of pool all those drugs, right, under a price that would basically, like, sort of a set price called the reference price. And then it forces the manufacturer, right? Let's say that there is another manufacturer that wants to, produce acetaminophen, to basically match that price or try to go lower than that to basically try and, it's a really great way to lower a drug price. And then let's just say that you have a drug manufacturer that has a drug that is just as that is like probably the same thing as Tylenol, but they want to set the price a bit higher. Then what will happen is that if it's higher than the reference price, then that gap is usually sort of made up through co-payments, right? So you do allow access to brand name drugs, although the reference price, I think, forces a lot of manufacturers to basically lower it. I know we have 2 minutes, sorry. So, the US lessons that, clinical benefit assessments and value-based pricing. So it's this really rigorous look at what kind of drugs are you buying and are they efficacious, as well as finding the best value through something like, through finding the best price based on how clinically efficacious it is, as well as, whether there's a reference price available that you can also sort of lower the drug price itself. So United Kingdom, I think folks know that the NHS overall has kind of been a model for a lot of sort of nationalized healthcare systems. So they have 3 cost controls, and it's pharmaceutical price regulation scheme, the statutory scheme, and formularies. And so I won't spend too much time on here, but like in the same vein as both Germany and Australia, there's a very rigorous assessment of the drugs that are being that are sort of being put on the formularies, right? And so what the NHS will actually do is actually blacklist drugs that aren't, sort of therapeutic, or they're too expensive, but they don't necessarily, they will allow access in certain cases. But all that to say is it forces, again, drug companies to be able to kind of to make sure that drugs that they're offering are the most ideal for their formularies, and then also ensuring that price is something that can be negotiated with the government directly. And so last thing I wanted to just sort of talk about really quick was the Global Drug Facility, which Leo actually talked about earlier. And so at TAG, I do a lot of work in TB, and for folks who don't know, TB is now the world's leading infectious global killer, right? 1.7 million deaths, in the last year. So, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the drugs are so old, are unavailable, because manufacturers essentially see TB as a failed market. And so the Global Drug Facility was created to basically centralize procurement of drugs, with sort of the added benefit of doing market stabilization, ensuring that there's a consistent supply, lowering the price of drugs, and then allowing for generic entry and competition. One of the most important things around this is that, this centralized procurement model, right, is something that we really need in the United States, especially. And so, because we are seeing massive drug shortages at this very moment on a variety of drugs, including 2 key, and ironically, 2 key TB drugs here in the US, which is rifapentine and isoniazid. And what's also another ironic thing is that this sort of scheme is actually funded by the US government at $15 million a year, every year. And so what's even crazier is that even when we have cases of TB in the US, US patients can't access a lot of the drugs on the GDF, even though US funding is being used for this. And we're talking about low price drugs. So just like, not to shock you a bit, but like, when we talk about MDR, when we talk about having MDR TB, treatment costs can scale from about $50,000 to about $100,000 for a single case, right? And all of that is public resources that fund that. Mm-hmm. And you can't even get some of the drugs that are available through the GDF in the US, even though we fund that, mm-hmm. right? So just sort of kind of like, thinking about we're actually paying for a model that works that we can't even use here, right? I mean, imagine if we had something like this just in the United States. So just some really quick conclusions. POTUS is wrong. We're actually gaming ourselves. Countries like the US are doing it better and much more cost effectively, and that is the bottom line. We should be going after other countries because we should be just copying what they're doing because they're doing it amazingly better and much more cost effectively. Drug pricing controls has to be an explicit component of the U.S. healthcare system. And when you look at legislation and sort of single payer and universal healthcare movements, I think we really need to sort of think about what are the ways in which those proposals are going to be controlling the price of drugs. And then just some of these sort of kind of overall lessons. We need to negotiate from a position of power. Set limits on price to make sure medications can get in the hands of consumers. So selling, thinking about reference price sort of schemes, value-based pricing, things like that. And then building evidence on the most cost-effective therapeutics to drive policy. I mean, nothing is better than data-driven policy, right? So we should really force our government to really look objectively in the ways that they have already, right? And then utilize the research that they generate to drive policy that can ultimately expand access to medications and low-cost medications for people. Thank you.
Thanks, Suraj. I'll welcome Dana to the podium, but I just want to tell one quick brief anecdote that really makes this concrete, I think, is about a year ago, we were at an international conference, and I was tasked with meeting somebody in the conference center to pick up 2 bottles of antibiotics for multi-drug-resistant TB that cost like $50, so that I could deliver them in my suitcase to a physician in New York City so that the patient could avoid like a $50,000 treatment and to basically save somebody's life. That's ridiculous. Like, I shouldn't be like, personally importing bottles of medicine in my carry-on so that we can save somebody's life in the richest country in the world. So with that.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks, Leo. Thanks, Suraj. I want to just quickly acknowledge our co-founder, Tahir Amin, has joined us. He's in the back of the room, not wanting to be acknowledged. Welcome, Tahir. Thank you for your work. So it's been so great to be here this week. And what I think we all agree on in this room is that pharmaceutical corporations have too much power, and it's time to dismantle that power. And if I can leave you with any message today, it's that a root cause of the drug pricing crisis that we have here in the US is a drug patent problem. So what does that mean? Drug patents allow pharmaceutical companies to dominate the system. It gives them monopoly power, and that monopoly power gives them the right to charge whatever they want to on medicines for as long as their patents exist. So what does that look like? Let's take a look at the HIV drug Kaletra. So the first patent granted in 1989, and by stacking on additional patents and filing for additional patents, 108 in total, they were able to extend their monopoly power out until 2028. So almost 40 years of patent protection that allows them to price whatever they think the market will bear, right? What they think the market will bear, but we know that our market is not bearing this. People are not getting the treatment that they need, and the press and the public, and we heard lawmakers here this week, and everyone in the room in the opening session is starting to have awareness about how patents are a root cause of this drug pricing crisis. So I-Mak works in the patent system, right? And I know it sounds technical and wonky. We're going to be talking about patents and patent challenges and monitoring the patent office, but this is all based in the rights of people, human rights, and for people to have a voice in this system that is affecting their health. So I-Mak's co-founders started organizing in India, and around that time there were patent law changes happening that were going to decrease access to marginalized communities, particularly those people living with HIV and cancer in India. And so as attorneys, they realized that the work that they could uniquely do to affect change was to look specifically at patent system laws and changes that needed to happen. And they realized that they would have an important place, right? We have an important place with this patent work in the larger fight, right? In this larger fight for equity and justice and for people struggling to access treatment. So I-Mak was founded on this premise that private interests, drug corporations who dominate the system, were holding too much power, and that power needed to be balanced out with the voice of the public, with the voice of people, and that I-Mak could help work in the interest of the public in this system, particularly those living below the line of poverty and those who were marginalized. So after founding I-Mak in 2006, we decided that patent challenges, patent oppositions would be a key tactic to moving forward and balancing out this power. So in 2006, when I-Mak started its work, these patent challenges in the public interest on behalf of the public were only happening in 3 countries, right? Generally, these patent oppositions are happening between companies, not necessarily on behalf of the patients and payers that are being affected. And now civil society's work, I have no idea why the map isn't showing up right now, but civil society's work is happening in, there we go, more than 50 countries. And so let's talk a little bit more in the short term and in the long term about what these patent challenges can achieve. So remember that visual of Coletra, right, where patents stacked on top of each other extend the length of time that prices can be charged as high as we think the market will bear. But we discover through our patent detective work, right, we do these patent landscapes and really look at the evidence that companies are providing. And we see, in many cases, that there are not new scientific breakthroughs that are being granted patents. This is not life-changing innovation that's happening, right, that should be granted these 20-year exclusivity periods. And when we're able to show that evidence and challenge these patents, lots of things start happening in the system, right? Other companies can start filing patent challenges. We weaken the entire patent portfolio of those companies. We can reduce the periods of time that the patents are valid and ultimately drive price reductions by bringing generic drugs into the market sooner than they otherwise would have been able to come. And so that's a short-term piece, but what's a little less understood is that there are really long-term systemic changes that can come from this patent work, right? First and foremost, that the public begins to participate in this system that is ultimately affecting their health and well-being, right? We empower the public to speak out in their own interests in this system. We can correct corporate misbehavior, bring them to the table, and you know, this fuels the conversation around law reforms that need to happen, right? When we can bring evidence to governments and decision makers showing that these hundreds of patents that aren't new innovations are gaming the system and the patent system isn't working the way that it's supposed to, we can get support for change, to change that system, right? And ultimately, bring generics into the market sooner. But what's so important, and we've heard this a couple of times this week, which is really, really great, is we can start changing the narrative that pharma has built around innovation. This is not innovation that's happening, right? That deserves these 40-year pricing monopolies, power monopolies. And so these are just some of the long-term changes that we can see happening. So let's look at the impacts that can come when we're successful in these challenges. So on 3 HIV drugs in India, I-Mak's work and with the work of the Make Medicines Affordable Coalition that we're so blessed to work with, over $500 million in savings to the governments who are able to access those generics sooner. money that can be reinvested to treat an estimated 1 million more people, right? So these are important impacts. And civil society and advocacy organizations have a really unique role to play in this, right? The 20-year movement that Leo taught us about has so much experience now that we can apply in addressing the monopoly power that pharma has. We have now the community organizing experience and how we can empower individuals to speak out about this system that's so impacting their lives. We have the technical expertise, the legal expertise, the policy wonk expertise, right? All over the world where we are seeing dramatic changes, not only with the legal interventions, but law reforms. And now we've got this opportunity, right, to look across this continuum of knowledge and experience that we've gained and figure out how we're all going to work together here in the US in this new movement to be even more transformative here in the home of pharma, right? So it's important again to mention that we do this work in symbiosis with lots of organizations and lots of strategies, right? We know there's no miracle cure for the drug pricing crisis, but we've seen a lot of impact from these patent challenges and the opposition work that we're doing. So in 2013, on the hepatitis C treatment sofosbuvir, Gilead Sovaldi is the brand name. In 2013, challenges in the public interest were happening in India, but in 2015, we were part of the launch of a global coordinated campaign to file patent challenges in Argentina, Brazil, China, Russia, the Ukraine, and these are being successful. These we're seeing that these patents are being rejected now all over the world. And in China alone, this has the potential to have a $13 billion savings that can treat 1.5 million more people, right? So just in one country alone. So we have now brought this work to the US. In October 2017, I-Mak filed the first public interest challenges against Gilead Sovaldi, Gilead Sofosbuvir here in the US. You know, Clifton did a really wonderful job. If you were in his presentation yesterday describing the hepatitis C problem and the work that they've done in New York State and around the country, I-Mak's analysis of CDC data is showing that 85% of Americans diagnosed with hepatitis C are not getting treatment. Around the world, it's 1 to 2%, right? So this is a problem that must be addressed, and it's a problem that is growing with the opioid crisis and transmission of the disease. So, you know, Clifton, if you were in Clifton's presentation yesterday, you're not allowed to answer this question, but Leo brought up the price of Sovaldi on its launch was $1,000 per pill, $84,000 list price. Guess how much that pill cost to manufacture? So 17 cents, a little more than a dollar, just about $1, right? $1,000, dollar. Monopoly power, patent protection allows Gilead to do that. So we filed these challenges. It's been a tough road so far. 9 of the 10 challenges that we filed 10 challenges on 8 different patents here in the US, have not made it past first base here in the US. Even though these are drug patents that are being rejected in other countries on that map that we showed you earlier. It's a long fight ahead. We're in it to win it. right? Because at the end of the day, we shouldn't have to challenge patents that shouldn't have been granted in the first place, that are unmerited. We should have a system here that doesn't grant unmerited patents in the first place, right? So what this process has shown us is that there is a real need for systems change here in the US. And we are seeing danger signs already that this not great system that we have is set to be eroded even further. We have a new patent office director who has been very vocal about stronger patent protections and some administrative actions happening in that agency. And moves by pharma to exempt themselves, to upend the system that was created that allows groups like I-Mak to file these patent challenges in the US on behalf of the public, and bills, legislation that do just what they say, make patents stronger, right? So we need a watchdog for the patent office and other agencies like the FDA and the FTC that are in this process. We need impact litigation. We need legislation. And when, not if, but when those reforms take place, we need to make sure that we have proper implementation of the laws that are passed. So we have very high standards of patents that are being granted. So I-Mak has 7 policy suggestions you can find on our website. First and foremost, making it harder for pharmaceutical companies to get patents granted on ideas that do not meet the patentability standard that's set out in law. Empowering the public to have a stronger voice and be more engaged in the system and have more access to the patent system, and stopping pharmaceutical corporations from using the FDA to block competition. So, you know, we've got so much to learn from this amazing access to medicines movement that's been happening around the world for the last 20 years. We've built a strong, connected, international infrastructure that's fighting for social justice, human rights, economic justice, and we know how to work globally, we know how to work intersectionally, and we know how to work intergenerationally for this long-term change, right? So our time is now. We're all here because we know this needs to happen, and as the US movement builds, right, with thank you, public citizen, for bringing us all here and the work that you do and the work of everyone in this room. We get to fight in pharma's backyard, right? And we're going to have the ability to not just change things here for American patients, but when we change the US system, that will have ripple effects all around the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you so much for letting me share our work. Follow us, find us online, and I think my 2 minutes were up there, right? So thank you.
So I'm visualizing and trying to imagine next year thousands of people marching in the streets of DC chanting, "People over patents, people over patents, people over patents."
I use this. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Cohen. Sorry, that was really loud. We're running a little bit late, so I'm going to fly through some slides. But I think just to start, to consolidate what everybody has been saying on the panel today and in the previous days. So quick kind of interactive thing. What is the number one cost driver of any healthcare system on the planet today? Profit, but profit of what? What's the number one thing that costs, what costs the most in any healthcare system? Drugs. So drugs are driving, especially in this system, every single healthcare system on the planet, the cost of drugs, rather the price of drugs. What allows high prices to be charged? What's that? Yes, true. But what legal instrument allows high prices to be charged? Patents, because they provide a monopoly for at least 20 years, right? So what is the number one thing you hear from the pharmaceutical industry about why we need high prices? Because if we don't have high prices, we won't have innovation, then we won't have future cures or treatments. And that's kind of the bottom line with this whole entire story. Now, we know, because we've heard from many of the people here, that the actual cost of R&D has nothing to do with how prices are, how drugs are priced, right? Drugs are priced at whatever the market will bear and beyond, in fact, what the market will bear, because we're not actually bearing it today. And so this entire conversation hinges on a narrative, on an explanation about why we absolutely have to have high drug prices that is false. And so, but I think it's important for activists and for people mobilizing at the grassroots level not to be naive and pretend that there isn't actually a cost associated with developing new drugs. There is. It costs money. It is expensive. It is risky. It takes working across many sectors over many, many years. And so part of what we have to have a conversation about if we want to change how drugs are priced is, how are we going to finance the research? How are we going to actually incentivize and finance research in a way that doesn't force a trade-off between innovation and access, which is sort of the conundrum that we're in today. So just super rapidly, and I'm not suggesting that this is any kind of panacea, but I'm going to just explain one example, one illustration of a way to do research and development that actually puts affordability and access and patient needs at the center of the enterprise of biomedical innovation, rather than the drive for commercial profit. So when Leo mentioned that MSF created the Access campaign in 1999, one piece of or one pillar really, of the Access campaign of MSF that was created was focused on the question of how to stimulate research and development for neglected diseases. So diseases that fall completely outside of the market. I'll give you an example. We work on a disease called African sleeping sickness, human African trypanosomiasis, a disease you've never heard of. This affects thousands of people in Central and West Africa. It's a terrible, debilitating illness. Without treatment, it's 100% fatal. When we created DNDi in 2003, we were treating this disease in the field with a drug called melarsoprol, which is an arsenic derivative. In other words, a poison. It was killing 1 in 20 patients that we administered the treatment to. This is the other side of the access crisis, that for diseases that actually aren't lucrative, that don't promise a great financial return, there's no investment into research, so you're left with either nothing at all or drugs that are terribly toxic and totally inappropriate to be using for patients. So DNDi was created by MSF initially, specifically, to focus on diseases that fell completely outside of the market. So African sleeping sickness, Chagas disease, leishmaniasis, many other diseases you've never heard of. And but over the years, we've developed several new treatments that are, at least initially, mostly modifications of existing drugs. We've developed 2 anti-malarials that have been distributed to more than 500 million. We've developed several combination therapies for the fatal form of leishmaniasis. Maybe I can just quickly go to this. We've developed a pediatric dosage form of a drug called benznidazole for Chagas disease. And we've done this using a model that is collaborative, that promotes and incentivizes open sharing of research, knowledge, and data between different sectors, that of course puts patient needs at the heart of the enterprise, that is focused primarily on therapeutic impact, so true innovations that will benefit patients, and that kind of changes the rules of the game. We, as a society, have sort of agreed that it's okay that the overwhelming majority of drug development capacity be located in the private sector. We may not individually agree with that, but that's the system that we work with today. So while governments and government research institutes like NIH finance the overwhelming majority of biomedical research at the basic level, ultimately when you want to bring a product to market, when you want to actually make a drug, we have said it's okay that that only happens in the private sector. So we have no choice but to collaborate. So we try to collaborate in a way that changes, I guess I would say, the rules of the game. So from the very beginning, not as an afterthought, we talk about what is the ideal specification of this product that we're actually developing for a specific patient need. what is the safety level that we need to reach? What level of efficacy do we need to reach? What price does it need to be affordable to the end user? We talk about that at the very beginning with the companies, the academic groups, and others that we collaborate with, so that affordability and access is built into the innovation process right from the beginning. We try, don't always succeed, but try very hard to negotiate licensing terms with the companies that we collaborate with that are, to the extent possible, royalty-free, non-exclusive, that allow the maximum affordability and access for patients at the end of the day. And we're doing this in a way that shows that it really doesn't cost whatever today's sort of mythology around the cost to develop a new drug is. So I don't know what it is today, 2.6 billion, 4 billion. You hear all kinds of numbers that are not substantiated, where there's lots of methodological flaws in how those costs are determined. We have found in our actual data, and I'm not comparing apples and apples here, but just in our own experience, that for modifications of existing drugs, like the antimalarials, it cost us somewhere between $10 and $45 million to develop those new treatments. And for a completely brand new chemical entity, so a real therapeutic breakthrough, it costs in the neighborhood of 110 to 175 million. Compare that to 2.6 billion. And even if we know we're not comparing apples and apples, you get a sense of the order of magnitude difference when you're talking about what it actually takes to develop the drug, what happens when you aren't building in all kinds of artificial costs, and then you can have an immediate conversation about, okay, what are the manufacturing costs? What is a reasonable way for generic companies in particular to produce drugs that are available at a reasonable price, but at a sustainable price for them? So I'm just going to talk for a minute, just because of, time, about hepatitis C, which has been mentioned by many people today. So we know there's 71 million people with chronic hepatitis C in the world today. The overwhelming majority of those are in low and middle income countries. We have had a total kind of treatment revolution when it comes to hepatitis C, where we now have direct-acting antivirals that have 95% or above cure rates. And I think, as has been mentioned by many people, we have a major problem of access. So access programs that have been designed by the pharmaceutical industry that include voluntary licensing schemes and so forth are not working in middle-income countries that bear 50% of the burden of hepatitis C. And research has historically not focused on the genotypes of people that live in low and middle-income countries, because they're focusing on where is the market actually going to produce the most return, which is in high-income countries. By the way, it is also sort of disincentivized cross-company collaboration, even if combinations between products that are developed by two different companies might be best from a public health perspective. So what we need for hepatitis C, and what is starting to exist in little pockets here and there, is a pan-genotypic regimen between the blockbuster Gilead drug sofosbuvir, or a generic version of it, an NS5A inhibitor, or another class of drugs that can be actually implemented and brought to scale using a public health approach, as we learned from HIV. So we've heard already on the panel today that the price of sofosbuvir in this country is about $84,000 per treatment course, that the cost, and let's get clear on that, the difference between the price and the cost, is so much lower that even at about 100, 150, 200, up to 300, depending upon where you're manufacturing, a price for that same drug of between $100 and $300 per treatment course is actually profitable. So we've been working with many people in this room and in many countries around the world on a three-pronged strategy for hepatitis C that focuses on accelerating R&D in the public interest, using a public health approach, catalyzing access, so supporting efforts in different countries to use all the different policy levers that can bring the prices of medicines down, which includes patent challenges, compulsory licensing, some negotiations with companies themselves to receive price drops and so forth. Whatever is going to work in every different country, you need a combination of tactics and strategies. There isn't one silver bullet, unfortunately. And then working with treatment providers on the ground, ministries of health, NGOs like MSF, to simplify treatment strategies so that we're actually, like HIV, able to scale up at a mass level and have primary health care providers actually providing hepatitis C treatment to massive numbers of people. So we're working with a generic company in Egypt called Pharco to develop a pan-genotypic combination of sofosbuvir with a drug called rividisphere, which is an NS5A inhibitor like declatosphere, if you are following details of hepatitis C treatment. Yeah, most people not. We're working on using innovative licensing provisions, supporting countries in overcoming their intellectual property barriers by exercising the flexibilities in the International Agreement on Intellectual Property, which is called TRIPS. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to develop a new chemical entity, rividisphere, combine it with sofosbuvir, and make it immediately available as a generic so that it can satisfy public health needs. And right now we'll be trying to develop that. The commitment is with the partners is that we'll provide that at a price of $300 US per treatment course. These are some of the interim results from the clinical trials that we're carrying out. Don't worry about the details. The bottom line is that this particular combination is working extremely well across all genotypes, and very importantly, in what are usually considered difficult to reach or difficult to treat patient populations, which just means people who are particularly vulnerable and marginalized, like those who are co-infected with HIV, who are active drug users, who have advanced liver disease, and so forth. So this is just a very tiny example of what can happen when you develop an innovation strategy that puts patient needs and access and affordability at the center of the approach. And there are many policy conversations happening globally about this. They're happening at the UN, they're happening at the World Health Organization, they're happening within the G20, they're happening in the halls of Congress right over there, as many people have pointed out. And one of the most important things I think that we can take away from a session like this is that there do need to be multiple different policy approaches, but we absolutely need to tackle the problem by understanding the root causes. And many people here have pointed out what those root causes are. So far, we've been tinkering around the margins, saying, okay, we kind of do a patent challenge here, a compulsory license there. These are all really important ways to challenge the existing system. But if we are going to change biomedical innovation and make it so that medicines are developed to meet public health needs, and they are developed in a way that makes them affordable and accessible to the people who need them, we absolutely need to change the entire system, which means changing the way we incentivize, finance, R&D. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. So I know that this has been a lot of information, so we want to open it up for questions, and we have some roving mics for folks to ask questions. And I also want to encourage the panelists to think about what's sort of like your policy soundbite, because you have a room of activists here and advocates, and what's your policy soundbite that you would want people to walk away with? But let's take questions. Let's take 1, 2, 3 questions. So 1. Yeah, Heather, and then the gentleman. Mm-hmm.
I wondered what were the actions that people took scale of what it costs to sustain those actions, the campaign element.
Let's take the questions and then you guys can answer. So this gentleman here had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could address the role of nonprofits. I'm thinking specifically of like Bill Gates and Bill Clinton in kind of perpetuating this model that we have now.
Yeah. And then we have a question over here.
I'm interested in hearing or knowing of the national champions in Congress on the varieties, patent control, patent reform. Who are the key players who are really championing this powerfully? And if you could, who are the key targets? And probably there's a whole lot of them, but some sort of high-level summary of that would be great.
Right. So how did they do it? Tell us about the bills, Clinton and Gates, and give us some targets and champions. Yes. Okay. So anyone in the panel, please. I think we have one other.
Yeah, and I wonder what the how free trade and trade policy like NAFTA and such figure into this.
Right. Please.
So I'll be quick, and I want to put something out that's pretty global in response to all of it, right? Empowerment through education, right? Who thinks about the patent system on a daily basis and how it's impacting their drug prices, right? And so a way that we connected globally, it was through that education process, letting people know exactly how the system worked and how it was affecting the prices that were ultimately paid. So I think that's so important. You know, we've got this like patents 101 presentation that we're like, we want to go everywhere with and work on that here, because that piece is going to be critical starting right here in this room, right, for us to take this campaign out and connect to others and learning from what's happening in other places, right? We've got this now 20 years of experience globally. How are we going to take the successes, learn from the successors, what did and didn't work? We don't have time to spend on things that aren't going to work right now, right? So that continuous education.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Just on the general question of sort of how do the networks get set up? How does this work internationally? I mean, I think let's not forget that at least at the beginning of the global access to HIV treatment movement, we weren't talking about setting up big institutions or, you know, $50 million organizations like DNDi or even I-Mak or you know, enormous groups like MSF or even larger substantial activist organizations like TAG or HealthGap. Those groups were all essential on the global stage. But what actually moved policy change was small groups of activists with very limited resources who put the fire under the feet of their policymakers, their governments, to hold them accountable. And that was happening in South Africa, it was happening in Brazil, it was happening in India, and it was happening here with people in this room who were dogging, for example, Al Gore on the campaign trail, making it a political liability to not actually take a position publicly against exporting these extreme intellectual property provisions to different countries, which gets to the free trade question. So I think let's not worry too much about the big kind of international architecture and how groups get set up that are doing complex things like developing drugs or delivering humanitarian assistance. It has always only been the smaller groups of ragtag activists that have actually made it impossible for their governments to ignore their demands.
And just to add to what Rachel said, I think it was 2 days ago now that that Matt Kavanaugh was referring to the TAC model, right, of how they did it in South Africa. And I think it is a fantastic model. And I actually think that we as a movement can learn so much more from global activists about what we want to do here, to be quite honest, because they've been doing it for far more many years and in much more dire conditions in some ways. And so, to just sort of speak to the TAC model of things, right, like it was organizations like TAG and MSF and other sort of institutions of activists that were helping sort of resource a lot of that, providing expertise, things like that, but largely left it to the leadership of those within like a country like South Africa to move it forward, right? And I think like that is essentially sort of a network model of advocacy when you look at it as a strategy. And I think like there are many examples like that in a global space right now that we could be applying here that we should be learning from global activists.
Yeah, and I would add to that, training people who are already organized on this issue.
Yeah.
So you don't go around and like say, I'm holding a meeting on people who want to do patent, activism around drug access. It's like you go to groups who are already doing, say, single payer work. I'm going to train you up on the details of this so you can speak, knowledgeably on it, and so you can lobby knowledgeably on it, and you can integrate it in your existing campaign. So don't reinvent the wheel. Go to people who are already politically activated, and train them on this issue.
And I wanted to say one other thing, and it gets to the bills. I mean, I think we used to have an analysis. I say we, I'm like maybe one of two people in the room who was doing this work in the late 90s, and I'm looking at the other one right there. Back in the 90s, we were super cautious about like saying, we're talking about drug prices in poor countries, right? Let's not kind of disturb everything by making them think we actually want lower drug prices here. We thought that was good tactically because we knew it was an immediate answer or sort of problem that we had in rhetorically that the drug companies and others would say, well, you're just actually fighting for lower drug prices here. You don't care about poor people in Africa. And so we were really careful to kind of make this, we're only talking about a few really terrible infectious diseases in poor countries. And I think we're all now getting to the point where we realize that all the different, so it's totally impossible to make those distinctions now. First of all, we have extremely vulnerable and marginalized and poor people within high-income countries, and we know this. In middle-income countries, it's the most extreme inequality on the planet. In poor countries, we still have all the same problems, but it's not just infectious diseases. It's cancer, it's diabetes, it's hypertension, just like here. So I think this whole thing where we were like, only infectious diseases in poor countries and we won't talk about anything else. Well, that's not possible anymore. I think with sort of the Martin Shkreli stuff, with hepatitis C and cancer treatment costs or prices in high-income countries, we just have to explode those kind of old dichotomies that we used to use and say, all of it is a symptom of the broken system. And we cannot sort of cure that system if we're not looking at it that way. And the problem with sort of the Bill Gateses and even the Bill Clintons and so forth, those kind of neoliberal philanthro-capitalist, type of things, is that they are hugely important, and so many organizations are overly dependent on them, and they have totally distorted the way priorities get set. They've totally shifted power dynamics at the global kind of multilateral level, and that's not a small thing. I mean, that is what prevents more dramatic, more systemic change from happening often.
So you're saying the 1% will not save us?
Right.
I want to give Leo a chance to respond.
No, I'm just going to add a little bit to what Rachel said. Actually, I think Aaron's not here anymore, but he brought up yesterday how some of the studies for Truvada were actually funded by the Gates Foundation, and now there's still affordability issues here in the U.S., as well as because of the intellectual property regime, there's generic competition elsewhere, but not here. But the Gates Foundation is setting up a medical research institute now. I think it's an opportunity for all of us to encourage, let's say, open access and some type of, let's say, changing the system that we need, which Rachel was talking about, instead of just trying to reinforce a broken system. On the question of key targets for patent reform, I'm following. Well, we're following marginally in I can't really tell you on the, let's say, who to contact, but start with the blueprint, which we already mentioned today. Try to share comments on how you see that going in. I know, for instance, on the, let's say, another issues that which have been coming up on the drug pricing transparency, you can the leadership of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Hatch, as well as leadership in the Energy and Commerce Committee can put something to a vote if they wanted to. There's bipartisan proposals in both houses, so they're hearing from activists could actually, I feel, do a lot.
So definitely take a look in your packets and consider responding to the HHS RFI on the Trump drug plan. TAG and other organizations are doing that. Please consider everybody here on the panel a resource for you, and do not hesitate to reach out. And with that, we'll close the session and we'll let people get on to breakouts. Thank you very much.
No, you did great.